Hi there, welcome to this video on Java Servlets from in 28 minutes. This is video 2 in the step 2. In the first part, we learned how to build a basic web application. In this step, we'll try and learn how to build Java Servlets. We are right now looking at video 2, Servlets in 28 minutes. We started with video 1 where we learned how to build your first Java web application. After this video, you can go to video 3, JSP in 28 minutes, and later you can also learn JSTL expression language, and you can end off this series of videos with looking at a real world Java application. I mean, this is an application which is really integrated with a database with exception handling, logging, and everything built in. So that's the series we recommend you to go through. Right now we are looking at video 2, Servlets in 28 minutes. Let's get started. In this tutorial, we will learn what are the basic servlet methods. We learned a couple of basic servlet methods in the video 1. So we'll continue that and we'll learn a few more basic servlet methods. We will understand a little bit more about the HTTP request. And after that, we'll understand a little bit more about the HTTP response. What are the different response codes that you can return back? Section 4 is about interaction with views, that is JSPs. So how do you redirect to a JSP? How do you redirect to a servlet? And that kind of stuff. And section 5, we would look in depth about servlet filters. Let's start with section 1, basic servlet methods. In this section, we are going to look at two basic servlet methods, doGet and doPost. There are other HTTP methods as well. Unfortunately, we cannot use them in a Java web application. We will understand why. Let's get started. We are using an IDE called Eclipse, and we use Maven to run our web application. In the real world projects, these are the tools which are used. You are already familiar with the tools that are used. This is an installation guide that is present with the first video. You can use that video to install the tools that are needed as well as set up the sample application which is there along with this video. In the first example, we looked at the first servlet. The first servlet, we created a doGet method to handle the get request. This doGet method handles the get request. The first thing was, how do we create a servlet? We create a servlet by extending the HTTP servlet. HTTP servlet is a class inside the Java servlet package. We extend the HTTP servlet and give a URL to it. We said the URL to this particular servlet is /first. And what we are doing in here is, in the doGet method, we are setting an attribute called batsman name Sachin, and we are redirecting to a first.jsp. And if we look at the first.jsp, we are just printing some text out. So we are saying, buddy, this is working, buddy, this is great, this is really great, and stuff like that. Let's now get this application running. I'm on Mac, I'm going to use terminal. If you're on Windows, you can go ahead and use command prompt. This is the folder where my code is, so I would need to cd to that folder. I would do a mvn clean install to build the code. We did these steps in the first video as well. If you're having any difficulty doing these steps, do make sure that you go through the first video. I can run the Tomcat server by using mvn space tomcat7:run. The installation guide would also help you with the basic Maven commands as well. So now I'm running the web application. The application gets started. I can see the port on which the application is running. It's HTTP localhost 8080. So what I'll do is I'll go to Firefox, type in the URL localhost 8080, and the URL of the servlet that we have is /first. So I need to put /first as well. So it's localhost :8080 and /first. And let's see what comes up. This is exactly the output we are expecting. What we did until now is we created a doGet method, and the doGet method is handling the request. It's, let's say this is not coming from here, but it's coming from a database or something, Cricinfo for example, and it's being set into request, and then the request is redirected to the JSP, and the JSP is a very simple JSP, and the JSP is showing the stuff out. You see the output from the JSP. This is a very simple doGet. If you're not able to follow this, I would really recommend for you to go through the first video and get the basics right. The next servlet we created in the first video was the login servlet. The login servlet, we implemented both the doGet and the doPost methods, and let's see what happens with it. So on the login servlet, we created a form with two elements. How did we create that particular form? Let's take a quick look. So we have a form. The method for that particular form is post. So when I submit the form, the method which is used is post. And the action I'm giving as /login. This is the same as the action of the login servlet. So the login.jsp redirects to the login servlet as well. I've created two fields. One is email, the other one is password. Email, password, and we have a submit as well. So the submit button would submit this particular form. When I entered a value, so I just entered dummy email, dummy@gmail.com, and password as dummy, and click submit. It comes back and tells me invalid ID and password. If I enter the right user ID and password, which is user@google.com, password is password, and submit, it shows the success page. The way the code was done, in the login servlet, we have a doGet method to handle the get. When I just type in the URL, this is called a get request. So when I just type in the URL, the request which is sent out is called a get request. The get request is handled by the doGet method. The doGet method just redirecting to the login.jsp. So it gets redirected to the login.jsp and this page is shown. Once I enter a user ID and clicks submit, what happens is that the doPost method gets called. What is the doPost method doing? The doPost method is getting the email from the request. The method which is used is request.get parameter. So whatever email I'm entering on the screen is obtained by using request.get parameter. I'm putting it into email and we have the password, and what we are doing is we are setting both email and password as attributes into the request. That's not really important right here. What we are doing here is we are looking at email and password. Usually the authentication is done based on database or authentication system. But here we were just starting with our first web application. So we are doing authentication using hard-coded. So what we are saying is if email is user@google.com and the password is password, if both these conditions match, then send the user to success.jsp. Success.jsp is nothing but a simple JSP where it just shows the email and the password. So whatever attributes we are setting into the request are used to show the values. It uses expression language. This is called a EL, expression language. We'll learn a lot about expression language a little later. It redirects to the success page. If this condition doesn't match, then it would go to the else, and it's setting an attribute called error, and the text which is shown is invalid ID password. After that, it redirects to the login page, so the user can try again. This is how our login servlet is implemented. We have a doGet method, we have a doPost method. What are the other methods which are present in HTTP? In HTTP, there are other methods other than get and post. Those methods are delete and put. Let's try delete. You'd see that an error comes up, undefined attribute value delete. It's because HTML4 does not support the method delete, and even in HTML5 it's not fully implemented. It's not it's not the same across all browsers. So for a typical web application you cannot use these methods, but if you are implementing a REST web service, then you can go ahead and use the delete and put methods. So delete and put methods are also part of HTTP, but we don't usually use them to build web applications. We use them to build REST web services. If you want to learn more about the put and the delete methods, I would recommend to look at the video REST web services in 28 minutes. We looked at how to use a post, how to use a get, and we understood why we cannot use put and delete methods in a web application. So that's the end of our section 1, basic servlet methods. Let's move on to section 2. We want to learn more about the HTTP request. We want to learn how to pass request parameters in URL, and we will understand a lot more about request headers. When I type a URL in the browser like this, I'm sending a GET request. It is possible to send parameters along the GET request as well. So if I want to send a parameter, so it would be of the form param is equal to value. And if I want to send one more parameter, I can do param2 is equal to value 2 and param3 is equal to value 3. This is how I can pass parameters to a GET request. So in GET request, the parameters which are passed are directly part of the URL. Now, let's build an example. Let's build a small example. I want to pass in the batsman name as a parameter, and I want to show the batsman name I'm passing in here. Instead of Sachin, I want to use the batsman name which is passed in. So I want to say batsman name is equal to Ganguly. When I type in, because the code is not really implemented for it, the code right now ignores this parameter which is being passed. So let's now see how I can get this batsman name to come here instead of Sachin. The first thing, we see the code of the first servlet which is handling that request. The batsman name is hard-coded as Sachin. The first thing, let's get the parameter from the request. The way we get a parameter from the request is by using the request.get parameter method. And I can pass in the parameter batsman name, because that's the thing which we are using here. The name of the parameter is batsman name. So I'm going to put it as batsman name in here. I'll take it in a variable. String batsman name is equal to request.get parameter batsman name. And now, instead of Sachin, I would put batsman name. That's it. Let's see if it's working. There you go. Whatever we put in here is what's coming in here. So I'll change batsman name is equal to Dravid. Works. Pointing. That's great as well. This is how we use a request parameter from a get URL. Next, we would move on to learning more about request headers. When I send a get request or a post request, along with the values which we are passing in along with the request, there are something called header which are sent along with the request. We can actually see them by doing right click, inspect element, go to the network tab and reload the page. And you'd see that there's a get request being sent. The get request is sent with this URL to this particular domain. And you can see a little bit of information about how big this file size is and all that kind of stuff. When I click it, I can see the response which is coming back. The response which is coming back is the HTML content. The HTML content comes back to the browser and browser shows it. So this is the response which is coming back. There is something called headers. There are headers in the request and the response as well. What you are seeing on the screen are what is called request headers. The request headers includes information about which is a web server which is hosting this particular application. That's localhost 8080. What is the browser that is used by the user? Cookies, caching. These are all called request headers. Request headers is meta information about a request. This meta information is used by things like a server. Let's say when I get a request from Firefox, I would want to handle it differently compared to when I get a request from Internet Explorer. Then I can use the user agent header. The cookie might be used to establish a user session. These are what are called request headers. If you look at the response headers are what the web server sends along with the response. It contains information like what's the length of the response, what is the content type of the response. The content type is text or HTML, but if let's say I'm downloading a PDF document, then the content type would be PDF. The other information which is shown in the response header here is what's the date on the server and what is the type of the server. Now that we looked at request and response headers, we'll try and get the request headers in a servlet and print them to the console. Let's see how to do that. In the request, there is a method called getHeaderNames. It returns an enumeration. I'll go ahead and input the enumeration with all the headers that are present in the request. What we need to do to print all of them to the console is to loop over them using an iterator and print them out to the console. The way we do that is by using the while loop. So what we are doing here is we are taking the header names, and while it has more elements, we are getting the next element, getting the header name, and we are getting the request.getHeader header name. So I'm getting the name of the attribute and the value of the attribute by passing that name to the getHeader method. So we are getting the header name and the header value, and we are also printing it out to the console. In the first servlet, what we have done is we are now printing out the content of the request headers to the console. Let's go ahead and run this thing. There's no change in the output of it, but let's look at the console. If you look at the console right now, it's printing all these values. These are the values we looked at in the request header earlier. So the values which we had in the request header, we are able to access them from the servlet. So host, localhost 8080, user agent, Mozilla, Firefox, cookies, connections. This is exactly the same information that we saw earlier. This is how you access request headers from a servlet. In section 2, we saw a little bit more about the HTTP request. We saw how to read request parameters from a GET URL, and also we looked at how to access the request headers. The method we used to access request headers would work both for a POST request and a GET request as well. Now let's move on to the next section where we will learn more about HTTP response. HTTP response is one of the most important concepts in a web application development. When a web server gets a request, it can respond back with any number of response statuses. The most probable response status is 200, that is success. I'm going to a web application and the thing which is giving me back is 200. Okay, that's typically the most frequent response type. The other two response types we are seeing on the screen are 400 for a bad request and 401 for a not authorized. When a user is not authorized to access a particular thing, we return a 401. We will see how to implement it a little later. When a page is not found, we return a 404. So when a page is not found, let's see when a 404 is returned. We have not defined in this application how to handle the root request. If I type in localhost :8080, we have not defined how to handle it. Let's see what happens. It returns a HTTP status 404. You'd see that there's a red icon and it says 404. Page not found is thrown when the URL you are typing in is not what the server expects. Whatever URL you are trying to access does not exist on this server. The next type of response is 500, internal server error. Let's try to replicate that. The easiest way to replicate a 500, a server error, is by throwing an exception from the servlet. I'm going to the login servlet. This is just a dummy example. So I'm going to do a throw new runtime exception, and you can pass in a string as well to identify the exception. Something went wrong. It doesn't help anybody, something went wrong, but just to pass something. So now if I hit the login URL with a get, you see what's written back? It says HTTP status 500, something went wrong. That's exactly what I returned in the exception. And you'd see that the status here is as well 500, internal server error. So the status of 500 is typically returned by a web application when some exception happens when processing the request. This is the situation in which an exception is thrown and the web server didn't handle it, and so it returns a status 500 back to the browser. I don't want this functionality in here, so I'll remove this for now. The one thing which we skipped was 401, not authorized. I can show an example of that on the doGet as well. The way we can set a response status 401 is by using the response object in the servlet and calling a set status method 401, and this is the text. I mean, this can be anything. I'm putting in not authorized in here. 401 is the one which signifies that it's not authorized. In the response.getWriter.println, I'm just saying get out of here. I mean, this is exactly what the message is shown to the user. So the response we are sending back is of status 401, and what we are telling him is get out of here because you're not authorized. You're not authorized to be here. Just get out of here. So that's basically what we are telling him. And let's execute the login now again. If you look at it, the text which is shown to the user is get out of here. And if you look at the network tab, it shows the response status is 401. So the get request got a response status 401. The same thing in case of a bad request. So let's now see the example for response status 400. What we are doing in here is we are setting a response.set status 400 bad request, and we are checking for if there's a parameter. So what we are telling the user is if there is no parameter called username, I mean along with the request I'm expecting a parameter called username. If that parameter is not there, then it's a bad request. I'm going to instruct the user to send in the parameter username. Let's see what happens. So if I refresh the page, that's exactly what I see. Send in a parameter username and you'd see that it's 400, bad request. However, if I send in a parameter username, how do I do that? Is username is equal to some dummy user. And then you can go to the login page. I mean, the most important thing to understand is in this tutorial, especially in this particular video, we did a lot of things, a lot of funny things which would not be done in a real world application. It's just to get a good understanding of how things work. And I took the easiest ways to demonstrate you how things work. In the last video in this series, in the real world application, you'd look at really how these things are handled in a real world application. In this section, we learned about the different response statuses and which situation what response code is returned back. In the next section, we are going to talk about interactions with views. In the first video, we learned how to redirect to a JSP. We used something called a request dispatcher. Now, let's learn how to redirect to another servlet. We will also learn how to share data with a view. In the previous video, we learned that we have to use the request.get dispatcher and pass it in the name of the JSP and then call the forward method, and the request is redirected to the login.jsp. When a user login is successful, instead of sending to the success JSP, I would want to send him to the first page of the application. And to send him to the first page of the application, I want to send him to this URL. Once a user login is successful, I want to send him to this URL and show him this. So user types in a username password, it's right, and then I want to send him to this URL. So here, instead of the JSP, I want to redirect it to the servlet which is handling this particular URL. How do I do that? I'm going to the login page, I'm typing username, password, and clicking submit. It goes to the success page. Now I don't want it to go to the success JSP, but I would want to redirect the user to the first page. How do I do that? The way I would do that is by redirecting it to the URL. So when I get the email, I get the password, and the email and the password are right. In that case, I would want to redirect him to the first URL. And I would go to the first servlet and I would get the request parameter. I would want, instead of batsman name, I want to use the username which is being sent. So I want to use the email parameter which is being sent, and I'll set it as the batsman name, and I'll see if it appears on the screen. Let's go back, user@google.com, password, submit. It says the first URL does not support the post method. What we'll do is make the first servlet support the post request as well. I want to use the doPost method, and in the doPost method, I don't want to do any different things. So I'll just forward it to the doGet request. So doGet request response. Let's see what happens now. Let's go back to the login page, type in the password, click submit. Okay, that's perfect. So it's showing the message. It's also showing the username which we entered is a great guy. So this can be the typical login page of an application. One thing you can already notice in here is that the URL is still /login. So even though I redirected here the user to /first, the redirection is internal to the web server. So it's not shown to the user. So we redirected to this first servlet, and the first servlet handled the request. So if you look at the flow was, we started with the login page. Login page was rendered by the login servlet. I click the button. So a post request is created. It would come here. The user ID and password matched, and then I'm redirecting it to the first servlet by using its URL that is mapped. So first servlet, we know the URL which is mapped is /first. So I'm using that to send the request. This is called a redirecting a request to the first servlet. So now we know how to redirect to a JSP, and we know how to redirect to a servlet as well. One thing you need to be sure of before redirecting to a servlet is, because this is a doPost method, when you redirect, it expects a doPost method to be present here as well. So you have to implement a doPost servlet in the servlet where I'm redirecting to. Here I don't want to do anything special in the doPost. So what I did was just redirect it back to the doGet method which is already implemented. So in this section we learned how to redirect to a view and the servlet. Regarding sharing data with a view, we already looked at a number of ways of doing it. One of the ways of sharing the data with a view is by setting an attribute into the request. The other way of sharing data with a view is by putting something into a session. It is not really recommended to put data into a session. Session data should be avoided as much as possible. The recommended way to share data between a servlet and the JSP is by putting something into a request. So set an attribute into the request and send it to the view, and the view can access it. Next, we would move on to something called servlet filters. Earlier, in the first servlet, we implemented a small functionality. We printed the request headers which are arriving at that particular servlet. Let's say for every servlet in the application, first servlet, login servlet, and let's say there are a couple of others, second servlet, third servlet. When a request arrives at any of these servlets, I want to print something to the console. That's the values in the request and also the header values. I have 4 servlets. First servlet, login servlet. Let's create a second servlet. Let's assume there is another one as well, third servlet. So when a request arrives at any of these servlets, I would want to print the content of the request header and also the parameters which are there in the request. One way of doing it is I can copy this code, put it in every method. So I can go to login servlet, copy this in the doGet and the doPost. So I can copy it here and copy it here. But that means I am replicating the same logic everywhere. Probably I can create a method for it and call that method everywhere. But still I have to call this in every servlet. JE introduced a concept called filters for this kind of functionality. So if there is a group of servlets and I want to do something before each of these servlets is called, then I can do that functionality in something called a filter. The way you can create a filter is very, very simple. All that you need to do is, I'm creating a new class. I would want to use the package servlet.filter, and I would want to call this particular filter as request logging filter. I'll go ahead and click finish. The request logging filter is created. The first thing in implementing a filter is it should implement filter interface. Filter is present in javax.servlet, so I'm going to import this as well. That's number one. Once I implement it, I get an error saying there are a couple of unimplemented methods from the interface. So I'll just add some dummy implementation to them. So for now, there is some dummy implementation for this particular filter. So the first thing we have done is we implemented the filter and some dummy implementation for all the methods that are defined in the interface. Don't worry a lot about these methods, we'll talk about them. We have defined a filter, but we have not defined when this filter should be called. When do we want to call this filter? That is defined by creating an annotation. So I'll create an annotation web filter, and you can pass in an attribute URL patterns. And the URL patterns which I would want to intercept is every URL that is sent to this particular application. So that's why I said URL pattern is equal to /star. So star represents any. So any URL is intercepted. And we have defined this web filter. Let's see if it's working or not. The way we will see whether it's working or not is by doing something in the doFilter method. What I've done is I've changed the names of the variables to request, response, and chain. That's the first thing I did. And the next thing I did was to add the system.out.println from the filter method. In every filter, we generally call the chain.doFilter request response method, because if there are any other filters, then we would want to execute them as well generally. So you should generally call the chain.doFilter method unless it's an error scenario. If you don't want the request to proceed further, then you don't need to do this. If you want the request to go ahead further and other filters also to intercept it, then you have to call the chain.doFilter method. That's not really important. You'll learn a lot about it a little later as well. But for now, the important thing is I'm doing a system.out.println from the filter method. Let's see if this particular thing is printed on every request. So let's go ahead to the browser and type in, I'll go to the browser and invoke the URL localhost 8080/login. Let's see if this particular method is called. You can see this particular thing from the filter method. So right now you see 2 times. Let's put this side by side so that we have a better visibility. So I'm typing it again. So it goes and shows it prints the 4th time. I'll highlight the current one. And let's now go and say user at in 28 minutes or any user ID and password and click submit. And you'd see that it's all again printed the 4th time. The filter happened the 4th time as well. Let's say I directly go to the first. You'd see that it's again printed from the filter method. So the filter method is getting invoked whether I'm calling the first servlet, the login servlet, whichever method I'm using for doing it. That's the concept of a filter. What we wanted to do actually was to print the header values in the filter. So what I'll do is I'll take this code from here, from the first servlet, and I'll move it to the doFilter method. There's one small change we would need to do. The request which comes to the doFilter method is a servlet request, and the header names is only defined on a HTTP servlet request. What we'll do is we'll typecast. So let's do that. So I'm creating a HTTP servlet object and I'm creating it with the name REQ, and I'll use that REQ in here. That's it. So we moved the code from the servlet to the doFilter, and let's see if now headers are printed after every change. So we have the browser. I'll call login. You'd see that the headers are printed in here. So let me highlight what's printed and now go and submit. The headers are again printed. Let's directly go into the first page. What happens? The headers are again printed. That's basically how you implement a filter in a Java web application. With annotations, implementing things like filters has become really easy. All that we had to do to implement a filter was create a Java class. We had to implement the filter interface, and we had to say which URLs we wanted to intercept. We wanted to intercept every URL, so I put a /*. That's as simple as that. And implement the doFilter method. In the doFilter method, we implement what we want to do, and at the end, make sure that you do call the chain.doFilter method. That's all there is to implementing a filter in a Java web application. In section 5, we learned how to implement a filter in a Java web application. That brings us to the end of this servlets tutorial. As we said earlier, this is video 2 in a series of 6 videos. After this video, you can learn JS expression language, and also you can look at a real-world Java web application. Once you complete this series of videos, we would recommend you to move on to the step 3 and look at struts and Spring MVC, and also learn AngularJS and REST web services. Good luck with your learning. Until next time, bye-bye.